The Orangery at Fenwick Court. There is a particular cruelty in being murdered by something that was meant to make things grow. In the spring of 1955, a retired diplomat named Sir Edmund Lattimore was found dead among his beloved citrus trees, not shot, not strangled, not poisoned by any substance a chemist would think to look for, but killed, slowly and deliberately, by a grafting compound meant for the bark of an orange tree. And the man everyone suspected, the clumsy, quiet, seemingly unremarkable head gardener, was not at all who he appeared to be. He never had been. The question isn't simply who killed Sir Edmund, though that matters a great deal. The question is, what kind of love brings a man back to a house that threw him out, to tend the gardens of a father who erased his name? Hello friends, I'm Jack, coming to you from right here in Ohio, and welcome to Midnight Pages. This one has stayed with me, I'll be honest with you, long after I finished putting it together. If you've ever looked at someone and been completely wrong about who they were, and I think we all have, drop me a line in the comments, because this story is about exactly that. Now settle in. Let me take you to Fenwick Court. Chapter 1, The Grove at Dawn. Mrs. Pauling found him at 6:30 on a Thursday morning, the 7th of April, when the light was still the color of weak tea and the birds in the lime avenue had only just begun to make themselves heard. She had not gone to the Orangery because she was worried. She had gone because Sir Edmund had not rung for his morning tray at 6:15, as he had done every day without variation for the 11 years she had served as his housekeeper, and because the absence of that bell, a small brass bell, tarnished at the rim, which sat on his bedside table, troubled her more than any shout or crash could have done. A man who changes his habits has either changed his mind about something or lost the power to act upon it. Mrs. Pauling, at 63, understood this. She found the Orangery door ajar, which was the first wrong thing. Sir Edmund was meticulous about that door. The Orangery at Fenwick Court was not a greenhouse tacked onto the side of a house, the sort of thing one sees in the suburbs with a few sad geraniums and a broken thermostat. It was a proper 18th-century structure, built of honey-colored stone and tall arched windows, south-facing, with a tiled floor and a heating system that Sir Edmund had personally redesigned after his retirement from the Foreign Office. It housed 37 citrus trees in varying stages of maturity, including a specimen he called his Dona Lucia, a blood orange of a cultivar so rare that Dr. Neville Frome, the horticulturalist from the Royal Society, had once offered to buy it for a sum that would have made a stockbroker blush. Sir Edmund had refused, of course. He did not grow his trees for money. He was seated in his cane chair beside the Dona Lucia when Mrs. Pauling found him. His head was inclined slightly forward, as if he had fallen asleep reading, though there was no book. His grafting shears lay across his lap, the blades closed. On the bench beside him sat a small earthenware pot of the compound Thomas Grieve mixed for the grafting work, a thick, greyish paste that smelled faintly of copper and pine resin and something else that Thomas said was necessary but that Mrs. Pauling had never liked. She knew he was dead before she touched his hand. The stillness of the dead is not the stillness of sleep. It is an absence, not a rest. She did not scream. She stood for a moment in the green, humid air, among the dark leaves and the faint sweetness of citrus blossom, and she said, very quietly, "Oh, Sir Edmund." Then she closed the orangery door behind her, walked back through the kitchen garden, through the scullery, through the passage that smelled of beeswax and cold stone, and telephoned for the doctor. It was Dr. Healy who telephoned for the police. And it was Inspector Rudge, arriving from Marchford at 9:30 with his sergeant and a scene of crimes officer, who telephoned, almost as an afterthought, it must be said, for Miss Marple. Not directly, of course. He telephoned his superintendent, who mentioned the matter to his wife, who happened to be having luncheon that very day with her old school friend Dorothy Brent, who was Miss Marple's goddaughter. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Miss Jane Marple had packed a small leather case, caught the 4:47 from Paddington, and was on her way to the village of Fenwick St. Cross, where she had been invited to stay with the vicar's wife, an old acquaintance from a missionary society committee, for as long as the fresh air does you good. Miss Marple was not particularly interested in fresh air. She was interested in why a retired diplomat had died holding the one tool in his orangery that no one but his gardener was supposed to touch. Gardener's log, the 28th of March. Applied the new compound to the donor Lucia Graft union today. Stronger formulation this time, added more copper arsenate to the base, as the old batch wasn't holding against the canker. Sir Edmund watched from his chair while I worked. He does that sometimes, says nothing, just watches. I don't mind it. Reminds me of something I can't quite place. Note, must order more pine resin from Hatchard's. We're running low and the Maya lemons will need attention before the month is out. Chapter 2, An Old Friend Calls. Miss Marple arrived at Fenwick St. Cross on one of those English spring evenings when the light seems to linger on purpose, as though it knows it has made the countryside look particularly well and is reluctant to leave. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Compton Hale, met her at the station in a rattling Morris that smelled of dog hair and hymnals, and talked without pausing for breath all the way to the vicarage, which suited Miss Marple very well, because Mrs. Compton Hale was one of those invaluable women who know everything about everyone and consider silence a form of rudeness. By the time they had reached the vicarage and Miss Marple had been installed in a small, cold bedroom with a view of the churchyard, she had learned the following. Sir Edmund Lattimore had been 71 years old. He had served in the diplomatic corps for 35 years, Ankara, Beirut, Nairobi, and had retired to Fenwick Court 12 years ago, after the death of his second wife, Vivienne. He was known in the village as a private, courteous, somewhat remote man whose only passion, since retirement, had been his orangery. He had one surviving relative of any closeness, his niece, Cressida Lattimore, aged 34, who had lived at Fenwick Court for the past 3 years, ostensibly to keep house for her uncle, though Mrs. Compton Hale's tone suggested that the keeping had been more financial than domestic. She has debts, you know, Mrs. Compton Hale said, with the particular relish that village women reserve for the financial misfortunes of the young. Card games. London friends. That sort of thing. The household was small. Mrs. Pauling, the housekeeper, had been with Sir Edmund since his return from Nairobi. There was a daily woman from the village, a Mrs. Trutt, who came in to do the rough work. And there was the gardener, Thomas Grieve. A strange young man, Mrs. Compton Hale said. Quiet. Keeps to himself. Came with references from a nursery in Devon, I believe, but nobody quite knows his people. Terribly clumsy, poor thing, forever dropping things and tripping over the edging stones. Sir Edmund kept him on because he has a gift with the trees, an absolute gift, but honestly, you'd never know it to look at him. He has the manner of a man who is trying very hard to take up as little space as possible. Miss Marple, who was knitting and had not appeared to be listening with any particular attention, said, "How long has he been at Fenwick Court?" 18 months. Perhaps 2 years. And did Sir Edmund hire him personally? I believe Mrs. Pauling handled it. She manages that sort of thing. Sir Edmund concerned himself with the trees, not the staff, though he took a curious interest in Thomas, now I think about it. Used to spend hours in the Orangery with him, watching him work. Thomas does the grafting, you see. It's delicate work and Edmund would never let anyone else near his donor Lucia. Miss Marple said nothing more about Thomas Grieve, but she made a small, precise note in the margin of her mind, the sort of note she had been making for 60 years, in the way that a birdwatcher notes the arrival of an unfamiliar species without yet knowing whether it is rare or merely lost. Chapter 3: The Household at Fenwick Court. Miss Marple called at Fenwick Court the following morning, on the pretext of delivering a jar of Mrs. Compton Hale's damson preserve and expressing condolences. Inspector Rudge, who was interviewing the household in the library, was not entirely pleased to see her, but he had worked with her once before, the business with the poisoned wedding cake in Little Bennying, and he knew better than to turn her away. He settled for looking uncomfortable and offering her a chair by the window, where she sat with her knitting and her air of gentle bewilderment and listened to everything. Cressida Lattimore was the first to be interviewed in Miss Marple's presence. She was a tall, angular woman with sharp cheekbones and an expensive cardigan worn at the elbows, which told Miss Marple a great deal about the state of her finances. She smoked continuously, long, thin cigarettes that she held between her second and third fingers, and answered Inspector Rudge's questions with the brittle composure of someone who has rehearsed her grief. "I was in my room all evening," she said. "I went up at 9:30. Uncle Edmund was already in the Orangery. He went out after dinner, as he always did. I heard nothing. I knew nothing until Mrs. Pauling woke me." "And your relations with your uncle were?" "Perfectly cordial." A small, tight smile. "He was generous. He gave me a home. I am grateful." Miss Marple noticed that Cressida's eyes moved, very briefly, to a blank space on the wall above the mantelpiece, a rectangular patch where the wallpaper was slightly less faded than the surrounding surface. Something had hung there, something roughly the size of a small portrait, and it had been removed. Inspector Rudge did not notice. He was looking at his notes. Dr. Neville Frome arrived at 11, ostensibly to offer his condolences, but with an energy that suggested he had driven down from London at some speed. He was a florid, well-fed man of about 50, with the hands of a surgeon and the manner of a man who believes his expertise entitles him to a hearing in all circumstances. He had been Sir Edmund's friend and rival in citrus cultivation for 20 years, and his interest in the donor Lucide was well known. "A tragedy," he said, accepting a cup of tea that Mrs. Pauling brought without being asked. "An absolute tragedy. Edmund was the finest amateur horticulturalist I have ever known. The donor receive alone, well, you know what it's worth. What is it worth, Dr. Frome? Inspector Rudge asked. Frome hesitated. To the right buyer? As a specimen, a living cultivar with its provenance documented? Several £1,000s. Perhaps more. Edmund developed it himself, you know, a graft hybrid he'd been nursing for 8 years. There is no other tree like it in England. Possibly not in the world. And you wanted to buy it. I wanted to propagate it. For the society. Edmund refused. Repeatedly. Frome set down his teacup. But I would hardly kill a man for a tree, Inspector. Miss Marple, from her corner, said mildly, people have killed for less, in my experience. There was a woman in St. Mary Mead who poisoned her neighbor over a prize-winning marrow, though admittedly the marrow was only the last straw, the real trouble was an old quarrel over a boundary fence. She smiled vaguely, as though the observation had no bearing on anything. Mr. Selwyn Ord, the family solicitor, arrived after luncheon. He was a thin, precise man with silver spectacles and an expression of permanent, low-grade anxiety. He carried a leather briefcase that he held very close to his body, as though it contained something fragile, and he asked to speak with Inspector Rudge privately. Miss Marple, knitting placidly by the window, gave every appearance of being half asleep and entirely uninterested. She heard every word. Mr. Ord spoke quickly and in a low voice, but Miss Marple's hearing, when she chose to use it, was considerably sharper than her general manner of woolly abstraction would suggest. He told Inspector Rudge that Sir Edmund had recently given instructions for a codicil to his will, a codicil that would redirect a substantial portion of the estate away from its current beneficiary. He did not say to whom. He said, rather carefully, that Sir Edmund had not yet supplied the formal details. Inspector Rudge asked whether anyone in the household might have known about the proposed change. Mr. Ord said he could not be certain, but that Sir Edmund had been, in recent weeks, in a state of some emotional agitation, those were his precise words, and that a man in such a state was not always as discreet as he might wish to be. Miss Marple filed this information in the place where she kept all the things she was not yet ready to examine too closely, and went on knitting. Gardener's log, the 1st of April. Found the Orangery door unlocked again this morning. 3rd time this week. I've spoken to Mrs. Pauling about it. She says she locks it every evening after Sir Edmund goes in, but someone is coming in after hours. Nothing disturbed that I can see, but the compound jar had been moved. It was on the east bench when I left it on the west. I've put a better lock on the compound cupboard. That stuff is not to be handled carelessly. The donor Lucia is coming along. New growth on the graft union, strong and clean. Sir Edmund will be pleased. Chapter 4, The Inspector's Theory. Inspector Rudge was a competent man, which is not quite the same thing as a perceptive one. He assembled his facts with the care of a bricklayer and arrived at a theory that was solid, well mortared, and almost entirely wrong. The facts, as he understood them, were these. Sir Edmund had died of arsenical poisoning, arsenic absorbed through the skin over a period of several days, according to Dr. Healy's preliminary findings and the rather more definitive analysis from the Home Office pathologist who arrived on Saturday. The source of the arsenic was the grafting compound used in the Orangery, which contained copper arsenate as a fungicide, a common enough ingredient in horticultural preparations, but not in the concentration that had been applied to the handles of Sir Edmund's grafting shears. Someone had painted the handles with a solution of the compound, thickened with pine resin so that it would not rub off easily but would release its poison slowly, through contact with warm skin. Sir Edmund suffered from eczema on both hands, a condition worsened by his years in tropical postings, and he wore no gloves when he pruned. He handled those shears every evening, for an hour or more, for at least 5 days before his death. The gardener, Inspector Rudge, told Miss Marple, with the satisfaction of a man who has found the right piece for a difficult jigsaw. Thomas Grieve. He mixes the compound. He has access to the Orangery at all hours. He knows which tools Sir Edmund uses. And he lowered his voice. Mr. Ord tells me something rather interesting about the will. Does he? Said Miss Marple, who already knew. Sir Edmund recently instructed Mr. Ord to draw up a codicil to his will. The codicil would have left a substantial portion of the estate, not to Miss Lattimore, who is the current sole beneficiary, but to an unnamed individual. Sir Edmund told Mr. Ord he would supply the name later. He died before he did. How very inconvenient, said Miss Marple. The point is, Miss Marple, if someone in the household knew that Sir Edmund was about to change his will, and if that someone stood to benefit from the current arrangement. You are thinking of Miss Lattimore. I am keeping an open mind, said Inspector Rudge, who was not. But the evidence points to Grieve. He had the means. He had the knowledge. And I'm told he was seen near the Orangery at odd hours. Miss Marple set down her knitting. Inspector, she said, may I ask you something? When you find the compound on the shears, and you know that Thomas Grieve mixes the compound, the natural conclusion is that Thomas Grieve put it there. But have you considered that this is precisely the conclusion someone might wish you to draw? It is rather like, forgive me, rather like finding a man's fingerprints on a gun and assuming he must have fired it, when in fact someone has simply handed him the gun. The cleverest criminals, in my experience, do not leave clues. They leave other people's clues. Inspector Rudge looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, with respect, Miss Marple, I deal in evidence, not in village philosophy. Miss Marple smiled. Of course you do, Inspector. Of course you do. Chapter 5, Old Roots. It was Mrs. Compton Hale who provided the next thread, quite without meaning to, over tea and scones on Sunday afternoon. I don't suppose anyone has mentioned Edmund's first wife, she said, buttering a scone with the thoroughness of a woman who considers cream a moral right. Margaret. She died before he went to Nairobi, 30 years ago, it must be. A lovely woman, by all accounts. Delicate. There was a child. Miss Marple's needles paused, though her expression did not change. A son. Julian, I think the name was. There was some sort of falling out, one never knew the details, and the boy was sent away. Edmund married Vivienne not long after, and Julian simply disappeared. He was disinherited, I know that much. Edmund never spoke of him. It was as though the boy had never existed. What was the nature of the falling out? Nobody knows. Or rather, everybody suspects and nobody says. The rumor, and it is only a rumor, was that Julian did something, or was accused of something, while Edmund was away on a posting. Vivienne was involved somehow. She was the one who convinced Edmund to cut the boy off, or so Mrs. Pauling once hinted to the vicar's wife before me, the previous Mrs. Compton Hale, you understand, not myself. Mrs. Compton Hale leaned forward, as women do when they are about to say something they have been saving. Vivienne was a cold woman, by all accounts. Beautiful, yes, and clever, and very certain of what she wanted. What she wanted was Fenwick Court and Edmund's undivided attention, and a grown stepson, Margaret's son, with Margaret's face, was not part of that arrangement. The accusation against Julian, whatever it was, came from Vivienne. Whether it was true or invented, no one ever knew. But Edmund believed his wife, and the boy was gone within a fortnight. Vivienne died 8 years later, and Edmund came home to his Orangery and his silence, and that was that. It was all terribly sad. Julian would have been, oh, let me think, he'd be in his mid-30s now. If he's alive at all. Miss Marple took a very small sip of her tea and said, a man in his mid-30s. Yes. How interesting. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her room at the vicarage and thought about a man she had known in St. Mary Mead, old Mr. Harbertle, the retired schoolmaster, who had kept a beautiful garden and never spoken of his son. The son had gone to Canada, or so Mr. Harbertle said, though in fact he had gone no further than the next village, where he lived under his mother's maiden name and delivered coal to the very houses where his father's friends took their tea. The son had not come back for revenge, or for money. He had come back because there is a gravity in blood that no amount of silence can overcome. He wanted, Miss Marple had understood, simply to be near. To exist in the orbit of the life he had been denied. She thought about Thomas Grieve, his quietness, his clumsiness, his gift with the trees. She thought about the way Sir Edmund had watched him work, saying nothing. She thought about a man who was trying very hard to take up as little space as possible. And then she thought about the blank rectangle on the wall above the library mantelpiece, where something had hung and been removed, and she began to see, not the full picture, not yet, but the shape of it, the way one sees the outline of a far hill through morning fog. Gardener's Log, the 3rd of April. Sir Edmund asked me about my family today. We were in the Orangery, working on the Meyer lemons. He was holding a cutting steady while I bound the Graft Union, and he said, quite suddenly, have you people, Grieve? Family, I mean? I told him I had none. He looked at me for a long time after that. A strange look. Not suspicious, sad. As though I had confirmed something he already knew but wished I hadn't. I should leave Fenwick Court. There is nothing for me here but the trees. But I cannot seem to make myself go. Chapter 6, The Missing Miniature. Miss Marple returned to Fenwick Court on Monday morning with a fresh jar of preserve and a question she had been composing since Sunday evening. She found Mrs. Pauling alone in the kitchen, making a pie with the grim efficiency of a woman who believes that domesticity is a form of armor. Miss Marple admired the pastry, accepted a cup of tea, and said, "I notice there is a blank space on the library wall above the mantelpiece. It looks as though a picture has been taken down." Mrs. Pauling's hand stopped moving, just for an instant. Then she resumed her rolling. "A miniature," she said. "A portrait of the First Lady Lattimore. Margaret. Sir Edmund kept it there for years. And it has been removed. It went missing a week before Sir Edmund died. He was very upset about it." "Missing? You mean stolen?" "I mean it was there one evening and not there the next morning, and no one in this house will admit to touching it." Mrs. Pauling's voice was flat and careful, the voice of a woman who is choosing her words the way a surgeon chooses instruments. Sir Edmund questioned everyone. Cressida. Thomas. Even me. No one knew anything. "What was on the back of the miniature, Mrs. Pauling?" The rolling pin stopped again. This time it did not resume. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," said Mrs. Pauling, and Miss Marple understood, with the quiet certainty that had served her well for 6 decades, that Mrs. Pauling knew exactly what she meant. The miniature, Miss Marple would learn, though not from Mrs. Pauling, who had sealed herself shut like a house before a storm, had been painted in 1921, the year of Margaret Lattimore's marriage. It was a small, oval watercolor on ivory, set in a gilt frame, and it showed a young woman with dark eyes and a grave, intelligent mouth. On the back of the ivory, in Sir Edmund's own hand, there was an inscription. Miss Marple did not yet know what the inscription said, but she intended to find out. Chapter 7. What the Blossom Knew. Miss Marple asked to see the Orangery. Inspector Rudge, who had finished his forensic work and was now waiting for laboratory results with the impatience of a man who prefers action to thought, saw no objection. The Orangery, without the fact of death in it, was extraordinarily beautiful. The April light came through the tall arched windows in long, warm panels and fell across the terracotta pots and the dark, glossy leaves, and the air was thick with moisture and the scent of blossom, not sweet, exactly, but clean and sharp, the way lemon peel smells when you first break it. The heating pipes ticked softly beneath the tiled floor. A watering can stood on the east bench beside a coil of raffia and a tray of grafting tools laid out with surgical precision. Everything had its place. Everything spoke of a man, or men, who cared about order, about the slow, patient work of keeping living things alive. Thomas Grieve was there when she arrived. He was working at the far end, tying up a young kumquat tree, and he straightened when she entered with a movement that was too quick, too startled, for a man with nothing to hide. He was younger than she had expected, 35, perhaps, with dark eyes and a face that might have been handsome if it had not been so carefully blank. His hands, she noticed, were beautiful, long-fingered, precise, the hands of a man who understood living things. Not the hands of a clumsy man at all. She watched him tie a graft binding, 3 quick turns of the raffia, and not so small and tight it might have been sewn, and she thought of the wheelbarrow he had reportedly overturned in the kitchen garden last week, and the edging stones he was always said to be tripping over, and the contradiction was so plain that she wondered how anyone in the household had failed to see it. "Mr. Grieve," she said, "what a beautiful place this is." "Sir Edmund built it up from almost nothing," Thomas said. His voice was low, with a faint West Country softness that might or might not have been native to him. "When he came back from abroad, there were 6 trees. He made it what it is." "And the Dona Lucia?" Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of tenderness that he suppressed almost immediately. "His masterpiece. A Graft hybrid, Tarocco blood orange onto a wild Seville rootstock. 8 years of work. He said it was the most patient thing he'd ever done." "You admired him." Thomas looked at her, and for a moment the mask slipped and she saw beneath it a grief so raw and private that she felt almost ashamed to have witnessed it. "He was a good man," Thomas said. "Whatever anyone tells you. He was a good man who made a mistake, and he spent the rest of his life trying to grow something beautiful enough to make up for it." He turned back to the kumquat, and Miss Marple did not press him further. She had learned what she needed to learn, not from his words, but from his hands, which had trembled when he spoke of the tree, and from his eyes, which were exactly the same shape and color as the eyes in the miniature portrait of Margaret Lattimore that she had seen described in Mrs. Compton Hale's parish register. Gardener's log, the 5th of April. Something is wrong. Sir Edmund did not come to the Orangery this evening. Mrs. Pauling says he is unwell, headaches, she says, and a tingling in his hands. I asked if I should call Dr. Healy, and she looked at me strangely and said it was not my place. Check the compound cupboard. The lock has been forced, not broken, but opened with something thin, a hairpin or a letter opener. Someone has been at the compound. I should tell Sir Edmund, but he is unwell, and Mrs. Pauling says I am not to worry him. They look at me sometimes in this house as though I have done something wrong, and I have learned that the truth is not always a shield. The Dona Lucia bloomed today. First blossom of the season. I wish Sir Edmund had been well enough to see it. Chapter 8. The Solicitor's Burden. Mr. Selwyn Ord called at the vicarage on Tuesday afternoon, a thing so unprecedented that Mrs. Compton Hale spent the first 10 minutes assuring him that the vicar was not at home and could not possibly have offended anyone. It was Miss Marple he had come to see. He sat in the vicarage parlour with his briefcase on his knees and his spectacles halfway down his nose and looked, Miss Marple thought, like a man who has been carrying a heavy parcel for a very long time and has finally found someone to give it to. I have not been entirely candid with Inspector Rodge, he said. The codicil, the one Sir Edmund asked me to draft, it was not quite as I described it. In what way? Sir Edmund did supply a name. Not formally. Not in the document itself, we had not reached that stage, but he told me, in confidence, who the beneficiary was to be. He told me 3 weeks before he died. Miss Marple waited. The beneficiary, said Mr. Ord, was Thomas Grieve. Or rather, the man Sir Edmund believed Thomas Grieve to be. He removed his spectacles and polished them with a handkerchief that shook slightly. Sir Edmund told me that he had reason to believe, strong reason, that Thomas Grieve was in fact his son, Julian Lattimore. He said he had suspected it for some months. The resemblance to Margaret, he said, was unmistakable. And he wished to reinstate Julian in his will. More than that, he wished to acknowledge him publicly, to restore his name. He said, Mr. Ord's voice faltered, he said it was the one graft he should have made 30 years ago, and he had left it almost too late. Did anyone else know this? I told no one. But Sir Edmund, he hesitated. Sir Edmund wrote it down. On the back of his wife's miniature portrait. A note, in his own hand. He showed it to me. It said, "This is Margaret's son, and mine. His name is Julian." I was wrong. And the miniature has gone missing. Yes, said Mr. Ord. Which means someone in that house knows. Someone read what Edmund wrote, and understood what it meant, and took the miniature to suppress it. Miss Marple looked at the solicitor for a long moment. Mr. Ord, she said, who inherits Fenwick Court under the current will, the will without the codicil? Miss Cressida Lattimore, he said. Every last stone of it. Chapter 9, A Familiar Pattern. Miss Marple walked back from the vicarage through the village in the failing light and thought about patterns. She had known a woman in St. Mary Mead, Mrs. Chetwynd, who cleaned the church brasses on Thursdays and grew sweet peas against her cottage wall and spoke to no one about her past. It was only after Mrs. Chetwynd's death, when they found the papers in her bureau, that the village learned she had been born Annabel Fortescue, the youngest daughter of old Squire Fortescue at Danesfield Hall, and that she had been turned out at 19 for marrying a clerk. She had lived for 40 years within 2 miles of the house where she was born, cleaning other people's silver, growing flowers in soil that had once been hers, and she had never said a word. Not because she was ashamed. Because she loved the place more than she loved her pride, and proximity, even in disguise, was better than exile. Thomas Grieve was Julian Lattimore. Miss Marple was as sure of this as she was sure of her own name. He had come back, not for money, not for revenge, but because Fenwick Court was his home, and the Orangery was the only place where his father had ever been fully himself, and Julian wanted to know that man. The clumsiness was a performance, a way of seeming harmless, of giving the household no reason to look at him closely. But with the trees, with the Dona Lucia, he was precise, gifted, patient. His father's son. And Sir Edmund had known. Perhaps not at first, but over the months, watching those dark eyes that were Margaret's eyes, watching those careful hands work the grafts, he had known. And he had begun to make amends. Someone had understood this. Someone had found the inscription on the miniature, or overheard the conversation with Mr. Ord, or simply noticed the way Sir Edmund looked at his gardener with something that was not an employer's interest but a father's grief. And that someone had decided that Julian Lattimore must not be acknowledged, must not be reinstated, must not inherit. The simplest way to ensure that was to kill Sir Edmund before the codicil was signed. And the cleverest way to do it was with a substance that only the gardener handled, applied to a tool that only Sir Edmund used, so that when the death was discovered, suspicion would fall exactly where it was meant to fall. Miss Marple stopped at the lych gate of St. Cross Church and looked back toward Fenwick Court, where a single light burned in an upper window, Cressida's room, and she thought, the most dangerous person in a household is not the one with the strongest motive, but the one whose motive no one bothers to examine, because everyone is looking somewhere else. Gardener's Log, the 6th of April. Sir Edmund is worse. Dr. Healy came this afternoon. I stood in the kitchen garden and watched through the window, and I saw Mrs. Pauling showing the doctor out, and her face was the face of a woman who has seen the end of something and has no power to prevent it. Cressida went into the library after dinner. I saw the light under the door. She was in there for an hour. When she came out, she was carrying something small, I couldn't see what, and she went straight upstairs without speaking to anyone. I mixed a new batch of compound today. When I opened the cupboard, the jar was lighter than it should have been. Someone has been using the compound, or taking it. I measured what was left against my log. Nearly a quarter missing. I am frightened now. Not for myself. For what has already happened. Chapter 10, The Hairpin and the Resin. Miss Marple asked to see Cressida Lattimore alone. Inspector Rudge, who had by this point arrested Thomas Grieve on suspicion of murder and was feeling rather pleased with himself, saw no harm in it. They sat in the library. Cressida smoked and looked at Miss Marple with the particular contempt that the young reserve for the old, the urban for the rural, and the guilty for the innocent. Miss Marple knitted. "I understand you were fond of your uncle," Miss Marple said. "I was. He was very good to me. And he was good to Thomas Grieve as well, I think. Rather unusually attentive, for an employer." Cressida's cigarette paused halfway to her lips. Thomas was his gardener. Uncle Edmund was interested in the trees, not in the man. And yet Sir Edmund instructed his solicitor to leave a significant portion of his estate to Thomas Grieve. Which would, of course, have reduced your inheritance considerably. Cressida said nothing. Her face was very still. "The miniature portrait of your uncle's first wife," Miss Marple continued, in the same mild, unhurried tone. "The one that has gone missing. I wonder, Miss Lattimore, whether you might know where it is." "I haven't the faintest idea." "I think you do. I think you found the inscription on the back, your uncle's note identifying Thomas Grieve as his son Julian, and I think you understood what it meant. Not just for the will, but for you. For Fenwick Court. For everything you had been counting on. This is outrageous." Cressida stood. "I don't have to listen to this. Thomas Grieve killed my uncle. The police have said so. The compound, the shears, it's perfectly obvious." "It is perfectly obvious," Miss Marple agreed. "And that is exactly what troubles me. Murder is very rarely obvious, in my experience. When it is, one should ask who has made it so." She reached into her knitting bag, that capacious, shabby, indispensable bag, and produced a small object, which she set on the table between them. It was a hairpin. Tortoiseshell, with a distinctive amber bead at the head. And caught in the curve of the pin was a tiny smear of greyish paste that smelled faintly of copper and pine resin. "I found this," said Miss Marple, on the floor of the Orangery, beside the compound cupboard. The cupboard whose lock, Thomas Grieve noted in his log, had been forced with something thin. A hairpin, perhaps. Your hairpin, Miss Lattimore. I recognize it because you were wearing a matching one in your hair the first time I saw you in this room. Cressida looked at the hairpin. She looked at Miss Marple. And the mask, the brittle composure, the rehearsed grief, the expensive cardigan and the thin cigarettes and the carefully constructed appearance of a woman who had lost a beloved uncle, cracked, quite suddenly, like frost on a window pane. She sat down. Chapter 11, Frost Warning. Inspector Rudge released Thomas Grieve at 4:30 on Wednesday afternoon, looking considerably less pleased with himself than he had 48 hours earlier. Miss Marple, who had presented her evidence with the gentle implacability of water wearing through stone, had also presented the miniature portrait of Margaret Lattimore, which she had found, after a quiet search that Inspector Rudge did not need to know the details of, in the lining of Cressida's jewelry case, where it had been tucked inside a velvet pouch and hidden beneath a tangle of paste necklaces. The inscription on the back was exactly as Mr. Ord had described it: "This is Margaret's son, and mine. His name is Julian. I was wrong." Cressida Lattimore confessed on Thursday morning, in the library, with Inspector Rudge and his sergeant and Miss Marple and Mr. Ord all present. She confessed without tears, without drama, with the flat exhaustion of a woman who has been running from something for a very long time and has finally stopped. She had found the inscription 6 weeks before Sir Edmund's death. She had come into the library late one evening. She could not sleep, she said, though the truth was she had been looking for ready money in Sir Edmund's desk, and she had taken the miniature down to look at it, as she sometimes did, because Margaret had been beautiful and Cressida, despite everything, was drawn to beautiful things. She had turned it over and read what was written there. She had understood immediately. The gardener, the quiet, clumsy, unremarkable gardener, was Edmund's son. If Edmund acknowledged him, the will would change. Fenwick Court would go to Julian. And Cressida, who owed £1,100 to a man in London who did not accept excuses, would have nothing. She took the miniature. She waited. She watched. When she overheard Sir Edmund telling Mrs. Pauling that he intended to put things right with Mr. Ord before the month was out, she knew she had very little time. The compound was the obvious weapon. It was there, in the Orangery, in a cupboard she could open with a hairpin. She knew about the copper arsenic because Thomas had mentioned it at dinner once, one of his rare, quiet contributions to the conversation, and she had looked it up in Sir Edmund's copy of Shepherd's Handbook of Horticultural Chemistry, which stood on the library shelf between Gibbon and a book about orchids. She knew that Sir Edmund handled his grafting shears every evening with bare, eczema-cracked hands. She knew that arsenic absorbed through broken skin was slow, cumulative, and difficult to trace unless someone thought to look for it. And she knew, this was the cruelty of it, the cold, calculated cruelty, that when it was discovered, every piece of evidence would point to the gardener. "I needed him to be blamed," she said, in a voice that was almost conversational. "Not just suspected. Blamed. Because if the police arrested Thomas, they would stop looking. And if Thomas was convicted, the codicil would never be signed, and no one would ever know who he really was, and Fenwick Court would be mine. She looked at Miss Marple. "How did you know?" "Because of the trees," Miss Marple said quietly. "Thomas Grieve tends those trees the way a man tends something he loves, not something he is paid to care for. He is clumsy with wheelbarrows and edging stones because he is pretending to be someone he is not, but he is never clumsy with the trees. A man who loves something that deeply does not destroy it. And the compound, the very substance he mixes to protect the trees, is the last thing he would use to cause harm. You chose the weapon precisely because it would look like his, but that is what gave you away. It was too perfect. Too convenient. Like a story that someone has written, rather than something that has happened." Gardener's Log, the 7th of April. The Dona Lucia is in full bloom. I went to the Orangery at first light. The blossoms are white, tinged with the faintest pink where they meet the stem, and the scent is extraordinary, not the heavy sweetness of garden flowers, but something sharper, cleaner, like the memory of a place you have loved but cannot return to. Sir Edmund would have wanted to see this. I think he knew who I was. I think he knew for months and said nothing, because he was afraid, as I was afraid, that naming it would break it. We had found a way to be near each other, among the trees, in the green air, and perhaps that was enough. Perhaps it was all we were ever going to get. I am Julian Lattimore. I came back to Fenwick Court because it was the only home I ever had, and because my father was here, and because I thought, foolishly, that if I could tend his trees well enough, he might see me. Not Thomas Grieve. Me. He saw me. I know he did. It is too late for everything except the truth. Chapter 12, The Root and the Graft. In the days that followed, the household at Fenwick Court rearranged itself in the way that households do after a violent disruption, slowly, awkwardly, with the particular English talent for carrying on as though nothing very remarkable has happened. Cressida Lattimore was charged with murder and taken to Marchford. Mr. Ord, relieved of his burden at last, set about the legal work of establishing Julian Lattimore's identity and restoring his inheritance, a process that would take months but whose outcome, he assured Miss Marple, was not in doubt. The documents existed. The DNA of the law, like the DNA of a family, could be traced back to its source. Mrs. Pauling remained at Fenwick Court. She had known, of course, had known from the moment Thomas Grieve arrived with his references from Devon, because she had arranged those references herself. She had been Margaret Lattimore's lady's maid before she was Edmund's housekeeper, and she had never lost touch with the boy who had been sent away. It was she who had told Julian when the gardener's position became vacant. It was she who had coached him in the small details of ordinariness, the clumsiness, the vagueness, the careful self-effacement that would keep the household from looking too closely. I did it for Margaret, she told Miss Marple, on the last afternoon, when Miss Marple came to say goodbye. She asked me, before she died, to watch over him. I gave her my word. And I am not a woman who breaks her word, Miss Marple, however many years it takes to keep it. You could have told Sir Edmund. I could have. But some things a man must see for himself. And he did see, in the end. He looked at that boy's hands working the grafts and he saw Margaret's hands, and he knew. She paused. The tragedy is not that Edmund died. He was old and tired, and he had been carrying his guilt for 30 years. The tragedy is that he died 3 weeks too soon. 3 weeks, and Julian would have had his name back. Miss Marple took her hand and held it for a moment. "He has it now," she said. "It will be on paper soon enough. But he has had it, the truth of it, since the moment Sir Edmund wrote those words on the back of the portrait. A man does not write 'I was wrong' unless he means to put it right." She thought, as she walked through the kitchen garden toward the Orangery, of Mr. Harbottle again, the retired schoolmaster in St. Mary Mead, and his son who delivered coal under another name. That story had not ended well. The son had died of pneumonia in his rented cottage, and Mr. Harbottle had stood at the graveside and wept for a stranger, because he had never allowed himself to weep for his child. The recognition had come too late, and the silence had outlasted both of them. But this was not that story. This story still had time to end differently. Not every graft fails. Not every silence is permanent. Some sons come home, and some fathers, given the chance, find the words. Julian Lattimore, Thomas Grieve no longer, stood in the Orangery doorway as Miss Marple left. He was holding a pair of grafting shears, new ones, not the ones that had killed his father, and his hands were steady. Behind him, the Dona Lucia stood in its terracotta pot, its branches heavy with white blossom, the graft union at its base thick and scarred and strong, 8 years of patient work made visible in living wood. "Miss Marple," he said. "Thank you. You have your father's trees to look after," she said. "And your mother's portrait to hang back on the wall. I think that is enough to be going on with." He smiled, the first real smile she had seen from him, and it was Margaret's smile, and Edmund's too, the graft that holds when the root and the scion are true. Chapter 13, Bitter Fruit and Blossom. Miss Marple caught the 5:15 from Fenwick Cross on a Friday evening, as the light was doing that lingering thing again and the hedgerows were thick with cow parsley and the promise of summer. Mrs. Compton Hale drove her to the station in the rattling Morris and talked without pausing for breath, as was her custom, and Miss Marple listened and nodded and said how interesting at the appropriate intervals and thought her own thoughts. She thought about grafting. About the patience of it, the careful joining of one living thing to another, the binding, the waiting, the not knowing whether the union would take. She thought about Sir Edmund, who had spent 8 years grafting a tree and 30 years failing to graft a family, and who had understood, at the very end, that the two tasks were not so different. She thought about Julian, who had come home in disguise and found his father in the only language they shared, the quiet, green, unhurried language of growing things. And she thought about Cressida, who had seen a tree worth thousands of pounds and a house worth tens of thousands and a gardener who stood between her and all of it, and who had reached for the one weapon that would destroy everything, not a gun or a knife, but the very compound that was meant to make things grow. There was a symmetry in that which Miss Marple found neither elegant nor satisfying, but simply sad. The cleverest murders, she had often reflected, are committed by people who are intelligent enough to plan but not wise enough to understand what they're destroying. The train came. Miss Marple boarded. She settled into her seat with her knitting and her carpet bag and her small, sharp, undeceivable eyes, and she thought about St. Mary Mead, where the gardens would be coming into bloom and Mrs. Bantry would have opinions about the dahlias, and there would be a new scandal at the Women's Institute that would require her quiet attention. And she thought, one last time, about the Dona Lucia, blooming white and faintly pink in the orangery at Fenwick Court, tended now by the hands it was always meant to be tended by, a graft that held, a thing that grew. Some stories end with justice. Some end with punishment. The best ones, Miss Marple had always believed, end with something growing where nothing was expected to grow, a blossom on a grafted branch, a name restored to a family tree, a son come home. And that, friends, is where we leave Fenwick Court, the orangery door open to the spring air, the trees in bloom, and the truth, as it always does, putting down roots. Thank you for spending this hour with me. I'm Jack. This has been Midnight Pages, and if this one stayed with you the way it stayed with me, leave me a thought in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe if you haven't, share this with someone who loves a good mystery, and I'll see you in the next chapter. Until then, sleep well, and watch what grows in the quiet places.